First of all, how about that first panel? Are we all feeling hydrated? The low-calorie beers are treating us well. Thank you guys again for coming out. This next panel that we're going to dive into momentarily, I think is probably one of the most important discussions that certainly we're going to have this week at Brewbound. But you know, it is one of the most important topics in the industry right now. Before we get to that, I did want to bring up Andres from the Colorado Brewers Guild, which we're supporting through this event tonight. So Andres, come on up. We got the Shooter McGavin giant check for you here. So yeah, so with your help, we raised $2,500 for the Colorado Brewers Guild tonight. Yeah, a round of applause. We're going to be coming back to the GABF later this year and also supporting the Guild with another $2,500. So you guys are beneficiaries twice this year. Congratulations. You can thank the BA for putting the CBC here this year. That's one of the things that we love about Brew Talks is we support the guilds in the cities that we go to. We'll also be at Savor next month, I guess it is, in May in Washington, D.C., GABF, as I mentioned. But in the meantime, maybe I can hold the check if you want, and you can share a couple words about what the Guild does for craft and what you guys are going to do with the $2,500.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Before I even get into the Guild, I would be remiss without thanking you, obviously, Brewbound, being an incredible partner and a supporter of state guilds. I think, as you guys know, we are basically the front lines at the state level, and we're trying to protect and promote craft beer at all different functions. And so your contributions of everyone mean so much to us and help us do what we do. So thank you. It's huge. Also want to take a second just to thank Sam from Dogfish Head, has been a huge supporter of the craft beer movement through the state guilds, huge in terms of our success, as well as everyone and their sponsors tonight. So thank you so much. Yeah.
You got the floor on.
It's like, oh, not often I get the floor. All I want to say, you know, there's a lot of Colorado craft brewers here. You know, the Colorado Brewers Guild is the state trade association for Colorado craft beer. We're working to serve you. We're working to make sure that you guys succeed in every single level. And we're stronger together. By working together, by having a common mission, by knowing exactly what we're doing and what our goal is, we're able to get farther and better every single year. We've seen that in our growth in Colorado, and honestly, it's just incredible to be here today. So thank you.
All right, don't forget your check. Andres, you can actually cash this. Take it to the bank tomorrow. Cash that one. I think they'll accept it. All right, let's get to our final panel of the evening. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, you know, I think undoubtedly some of the most important conversations happening in the industry right now are focused around the topic of diversity and inclusion. We heard it earlier today during the general session, the meteoric rise of craft in terms of market share and the sheer number of breweries across the U.S. is impressive and incredibly noteworthy. 9 years ago, there were 1,800 breweries operating in the U.S. Today, I'm just going to keep shouting unless you guys let me talk. I don't want to be rude, but this is a really important topic, guys. So I'd really appreciate if you guys give us the floor for the next 45 minutes. Can I get a hell yeah on this topic? Thank you. All right. So there are now more than 7,300 breweries, as you guys know, in the U.S. But the rapid growth of craft has brought with it a host of new challenges for owners of craft breweries across the United States. On top of that, many of these owners are running early-stage businesses that just launched in the last few years, and they're first-time entrepreneurs. So consider some of these stats from Dr. J, one of our panelists that will be joining Justin, my colleague, and I up here on the stage in just a moment. Women make up just over half of the general U.S. population, but comprise only 31% of craft beer drinkers. People of color make up approximately 32% of drinking age Americans, but only 20% of craft beer drinkers. If you look around the room here today and across the entire industry, you'll see it's a white, male-dominated segment of the alcohol marketplace that is trying to figure out not only how it can reach a more diverse consumer base, but how it can become more diverse itself. And yes, I fully realize that there will be two white men leading this conversation tonight. We've found that this Brew Talks platform enables some really thought-provoking discussions on a myriad of different topics, and this one was really important for us to have this time. So, here's the big question. How can craft beer shake its image of selling almost exclusively to quote-unquote young white dudes with beards, as Dr. J so famously said during last year's CBC? Here with us today to discuss the ways in which the craft brewing industry can diversify are the aforementioned Dr. J. Nikol Jackson-Beckham, Founders Brewing Diversity and Inclusion Director Graci Harkema, and Bow and Arrow Brewing founder Shyla Sheppard, as well as my colleague Justin Kendall. Coming up, guys, big round of applause for this crew. Take a seat wherever you guys feel comfortable. Sorry for all the signage and Dogfish branding up here that's obstructing your access to these seats at the moment.
Also, we're doing a podcast with this.
That's true. So this is a live podcast. We've pulled this play out before at our Brewbound Live event. We're going to pull it again. Access to this will be available on the Brewbound podcast, which comes out every Thursday. So if you're interested in re-listening to this at a later date, look for it on the Brewbound podcast. In the meantime, let's dive in to the most important topic in the beer industry right now, the topic of diversity and inclusion. It is more prevalent, it is more important than ever before, and as the entire industry works to evolve its own image while simultaneously reaching new demographics, in each of your opinions, we'll kind of go down the line and we'll start with Dr. J. What are some of the biggest blind spots the industry has as it relates to diversity, and how can the businesses within the segment begin to work to address them?
Yeah, so first, hey everyone. Hey. How you doing? Now, your blind spots. Now, I would say one, I'll start with the caveat, which is a horrible way to start. But honestly, in talking to lots of people around the country in the last year, one of the surprises I've had is that there's a lot more awareness than I thought. So maybe the spots aren't quite as blind as they sometimes appear to be. However, I think there's a lot of fear, and I think there's a lot of hesitancy to jump into the issue wholeheartedly. If there is blind spots or just lack of knowledge, I would say it's in how to implement. So I've recognized something, I think I want to address it, but I have absolutely no idea how to go about it. So when we talk about blind spots, I think, tactics, strategies, hands-on approaches to getting the work done is really tough. But I think, by and large, we are an industry who has come around the corner, right, and is saying, okay, this is really something we have to face head on, and now we have to figure out how it is we're going to do that.
Graci, you've been in the industry for a pretty short period of time, so I wouldn't expect you to know all of the history of all the blind spots in this area, but in the short time that you have been diving into this issue, what struck you as sort of the most glaring, obvious issues that breweries need to address?
Excellent, great question. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And yes, I am new to the industry, working in the industry, but I've been a consumer of the industry for about 15 years.
Yeah.
So I would say one of the blind spots, and it almost sounds arbitrary, but I would say the blind spot traditionally, especially as we look in the craft beer industry, has been self-awareness. It was very easy as an industry to be complacent on not being intentional on diversifying our business strategies. And so what's worked for the last 10, 15, 20 years worked till now. Dr. J's point, now we have much more awareness and it's at the forefront. And so now that it's at the forefront, we're being more intentional. We're having conversations like this. But even conversations like this, as it pertains to diversity and inclusion in the craft beer industry, hadn't existed until now. So our greatest blind spot has been being complacent and our own lack of self-awareness in moving forward and being intentional from an internal and external approach.
Shyla, this is something that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis as an entrepreneur, the sort of lone brewery business owner on this panel. So I'm curious for your perspective, which is a first-hand perspective.
Sure, thanks again for having me. We're out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see you all in person. We've had some good conversations leading up to today, but I guess without being redundant, and I've kind of given this some thought to try to, shed some light. I know some of you are out there wondering, what can I be doing differently? And so as a brewery owner, and as a brewery who's started to, develop beer labels and think of things like branding and marketing, I've given this some more thought. And, I see the industry, we're making some progress with regards to kind of minimizing and addressing, some of the sexist imagery, some of those things that we've been seeing in beer branding and imagery. So I think that's definitely some progress there. But also as a person of color, coming from a very diverse background, I think it's important that, there's more thought and sensitivity around just the presence of diverse cultures. And, at this point in time, I think it's a real cop-out to, pose excuses like, well, I didn't know. I mean, I think some of the tenets of cultural humility are, being able to just ask questions and inform yourself because we're surrounded, by diverse people. So that's one area I could see some improvement just around branding and marketing, more thoughtfulness to other cultures, and even us as a Native-owned business, as we're developing beer labels and some of the imagery that's reflective of the Southwest, we're engaging Native artists. We're not copying things, we're not appropriating, but we're actually engaging people from these communities. So there's some authenticity to what we're doing. So that was kind of something, and I thought would be pretty helpful to share.
Yeah.
Kind of a jumping off point on the topic of self-awareness that you brought up. On our call before this conversation, Dr. J, you mentioned that the industry needs to take a different posture. And it's an industry that needs to reach new communities and do so in a more reaching manner if it wants to continue to grow. What are some of the ways breweries can do that?
Yeah, so let me just clarify and then give you some examples. I think of my own kind of discovery and entry into craft beer in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I think to some degree, the me then is still lots of people, right, who discover this thing that's honestly full of rad people and rad beverages and rad experiences, and you get inspired and you want to reach toward it, right? And I think for better and for worse, craft beer has been the recipient of people reaching toward it for decades. And I think right now, we're being confronted with a moment where we need to shift postures, where we can't assume that everybody wants to work at a brewery so badly that they're going to work for free, right? Or that that's a best thing to do. Or that if somebody wants you to support their event or their cause, they're going to seek you out and ask for beer, right? So 2 examples there. You might have to turn the posture and start reaching toward other communities if you want them to have a relationship with you. So, like, no shade, But you might have to post your brewery opening on something other than Brewbound if you want other people to apply for those jobs, right? Or, right, if you want to use your beer donation programming or your philanthropy programming to reach other audiences, then you might have to jump on the damn internet and look and see how many heritage festivals are happening in your city and say, you know what, we're going to set aside this much volume for this part of the program, right? So it's just about becoming more active and less passive, because the industry's still rad, right? It's radder than ever, honestly. But it's time to kind of switch the posture.
How do you go about doing that and still keep in mind, sort of the point that Shyla made, which is you don't want to be appropriating and come across as though, you're just checking the box. Yeah. How do you do it in the most authentic, real way so that it's coming from a good place?
So, if anybody went to my seminar today, you have a 4-step program. Right there, right? But it starts with approach that relationship with a willingness to learn, right? Don't go in like trying to make the date like it's Tinder and you're like swipe right, like go in and say, I just want to learn about this community, right? So like maybe attend neighborhood association meetings for a while, right? Maybe go to see educational groups for a while, like get to know folks. Because if you just go in kind of thinking you're going to go in and fix the problems, or you're just going to be like, yeah, and I'm going to represent you, like that's crazy, right? Like you go in learning and form a relationship, and then you see what happens, right? Maybe it's not there, and maybe it is. But if you change the posture, again, not assuming it's about you, but it's about a relationship, then you're going to start in a better place.
Yeah. Graci, you've got a lot of experience from other industries. Maybe you could help share, some of the perspective that you've gained from those industries and seen kind of what's gone on and maybe what beer can learn from those experiences in, some of the ways that, or on some of the topics that we're discussing.
Yeah, definitely. So I've come from the technology industry, and in technology, diversity and inclusion it's a very common practice. Most of the companies that help support were Fortune 100 clients where they had established diversity and inclusion practices. And even though they had established practices, they still had challenges every day, which why they had called on me to help assist them. But what I learned too is it's all about intentionality and going about it the right way. It isn't, hey, we want to cut you a check for the sake of saying we donated to XYZ cause, but to Dr. J's point as well, it's about being authentic and building those relationships and understanding what those needs are, because you can't build a solution without understanding the need. And you can't understand the need without having that relationship and having that connection. So first and foremost, it's very important to have a personal connection, whether it's with a group of people or an organization, whatever the entity is, and then also internally as well, understanding what the needs are with your employees. You can't build an open, safe, supported work environment without understanding how your employees need to be supported in order for it to be open and safe for everyone. So it's taking that extra step, being intentional, being personal, and being authentic.
Shyla, during our call, you mentioned being very intentional in the way you've built your staff and your organization. Can you discuss some of the ways that you've done that?
Sure. So as a small business, there's kind of 3 big areas of capital that are really important to our success. Financial is a really obvious one. Human capital, which is the talent, your team. And then the third one that maybe gets sort of glossed over, but I think is really relevant to what we're talking about right now, is social capital. So, the networks, including, your community, other breweries in, your area, the vendors you work with, the customers you serve. And I think continuing to, foster and invest in that network and that sort of social capital is really critical to your success. Some ways, that we've fostered, I think, an environment for our employees that keeps them around and keeps them engaged and feeling safe in this industry. It starts with policies. As a small business, there's many balls in the air. You know, you're juggling and you're busy every day. And sometimes I think the last thing you think about is writing policies. But you know, we're 3 years in, and I started with policies out of the gate. I continue to revisit them every year, and you know, really pay attention to the experiences that I've heard, you know, my staff has had in other workplaces. I learn from that and revisit it ongoing. And so just implementing some real life, not just like copying and pasting from the internet, but being thoughtful about what kind of environment do I want to create in my brew hall, in my brewery, and how do I then attract people who, you know, buy in and feel safe and want to kind of uphold, you know, those values and that culture. So it really started with like writing policies and being intentional about them, discussing them with my staff. And we sign off on them at the beginning of the year, and we, you know, people are aware of them. So that's one. So it's like policies that address behavior amongst staff, but also policies that address behavior, you know, amongst customers. I think in the service industry, especially with alcohol, women still suffer. I mean, I've experienced it myself when I jump behind the bar. You know, sexual harassment, and I think having policies in place to address how to react to those situations in a very calm but firm way is really important. And not only having those policies, but enforcing them. So I think it's really important that I've empowered my staff to enforce them. In reflecting for this panel, it is unfortunate. You know, it is just sexual harassment tends to be the thing that happens. You know, there's varying degrees of it. You know, my experience was with a bar owner telling me to go flirt with him. And I, you know, was really nice about it and kind of got to know him a little bit and was like, just stop. I'm not interested. And then he sent me threatening texts telling me, you will never get a tap handle in such and such a neighborhood. So these things happen, even if you're a brewery owner. You know, it's unfortunate. So based on my experiences, like I said, I think it's important to, number one, have policies. Number two, stand by them. You know, number three, just empower your staff to also stand by them and give them an out in those awful situations.
So I mean, I think there's, a lot to dive into just there. Yeah, round of applause. I want to try to understand better what responsibility everybody in the industry has to go out and be proactive and try to let that bar owner know that his behavior is unacceptable, even if it isn't something that they've experienced directly, or maybe they're hearing from folks who aren't on their own staff. How can the industry at large, and the individuals within it start, piece by piece, breaking down some of these more unfortunate circumstances that just continue to exist? And what happens if the industry doesn't take a proactive approach on this?
I was really trying to punt there, non-verbally.
All right, I got you.
Save.
So it sounds obvious, but it's all of our responsibilities. It isn't just the owner's responsibilities or HR's responsibility. It's all of our responsibility. But that circles back from yes, all of us. Thank you. But that circles back to the point, my very first point, and the first question is how we got here. We got here because we were too complacent. We were too complacent to allow sexual harassment to happen. We were too complacent to allow disingenuous behavior to occur. We were too complacent for too long. And that's why the beer industry is where it's at right now, because we let that slide. We didn't have policies that we're enforcing. So great job to you and your brewery that you've enforced it. It's crucial and it's imperative for all of us across the board, because we let so many things slip. Like, oh, it's okay, they just had a few drinks. No, that's not okay. And it's important that as breweries and as organizations and as companies that we are taking a stand on that. And that's part of the reason why I was brought into Founders also, is to ensure that I know I'm working with HR and with our internal teams, and that we're enforcing behavior. We're not allowing for discrimination. We're not allowing for, they had one drink too many, but we're going to let it slide. And we cannot, as a society, we cannot let it slide any longer.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things you mentioned during our call, Dr. J, was having productive conversations when the industry needs to police itself. I guess I'd like to know, can you elaborate a little more on that and share what the ideal way is to have those conversations?
Yeah. Okay. So also, I'm ready to answer the previous question.
Go for it.
So I'm gonna tie it all back in. I'm gonna get there. So I guess I want to shift the question you asked. Right? You asked, like, what happens if we don't do this? And for me, that is like really heavy, consequence-laden, punitive language. And like it hurts a little bit when I think about inclusion and equity and justice and diversity, and it's thought of as negative consequences for failing to take action, right? So like I look out here and I can't see anybody, but I'm looking meaningfully at you because I'm trying to look like I'm meaningfully looking at you. And I want to ask you, like, you make beer, right? Yeah. Like what do you want? You want people to enjoy your fucking beer, right? Like you want to have people come to your brewery. You want to make money. Like you want this to be positive, engaging, and awesome, right? And so part of me is like, why are we talking about this in terms of punishment or consequence? Why aren't we talking about this as like amazing, exciting opportunities?
Yep.
Like why aren't we all like running around like, like this is the best thing that's ever happened, right? And like, I guess that's my answer to both of your questions, right? Like, yeah. I think the first thing we do is we turn this around and we stop talking about problems and consequences. We start talking about opportunities, right? Well, like we start talking about what we can do, and then when you think about opportunities, you accept that opportunities come with learning, and learning comes with mistakes.
Right.
And so I'm a teacher. I'm a college professor. I will tell you right now, my students fuck up daily. Right? It's what they do, and it's also how they learn, right? And if I excoriate them for failing to learn, they will never learn, right? But I have to let them know also, right? Like I have to hold them accountable for failing to make an effort. I have to hold them accountable for being unprepared, right? So this is not about abandoning accountability, but it's about compassionate accountability. About saying, you know what? You didn't get there. Let's do it again. Let's do it again. Let's try it again. Because the last thing I want is for someone to mess it up and just forever be fearful to ever try again.
Well, and I'm glad you made that point, because I think it is sort of fear of the unknown that has gotten us into this conversation to begin with and got us to this point. We don't know what we don't know as an industry, and flipping the narrative to a more positive, opportunistic narrative is clearly one of the ways that the industry can start to proactively approach this topic, it sounds like. So I guess my question would be, what can individuals in this category do to break down some of their own fears about reaching a new demographic or bringing making their cultures internally more diverse? How do they break down their own fears?
Yep.
That's for everyone.
Okay.
I'm going to say something that might not be an answer that everyone will love, but when it comes to fear, get over it. You know, especially when it comes in terms to reaching out to new audiences, diversifying internally, externally, you don't have anything to lose. If you continue to do exactly what you've done, that's all you'll ever do, and that's all the market share you will ever have. But we're in the business of beer, and we're in the business of growing, and obviously we want sales to increase. And the only way to effectively do that is by expanding upon your market share. And it's by being creative. That's by getting over those fears and doing things that maybe other breweries or other businesses aren't doing. And that's how I got into diversity and inclusion. So I've been in diversity and inclusion for 5 years prior to coming to Founders. And I got in because I was in sales. And I wanted to be an effective salesperson. And the way I realized I needed to be more effective than my competitor is I needed to do what my competitor wasn't doing. And that was reaching new demographics and taking over market share. And sometimes it's a little scary to do something that's unknown, but everything worth doing, if it's worth doing well, it's worth the risk. Because otherwise you're just gonna stay, you're gonna be complacent and your business isn't going to grow. It's just gonna be the same of where you've been, and that isn't going to work forever, especially in this market. As a business, you have to stay competitive. And so, yeah, I would say in order, how do you get over your fear? Get over your fear. But learn, listen, reach out to other partners, reach out to those who are in those demographics of who you're trying to connect with, and learn. Don't just jump out and say, hey, I'm gonna do this just because, but have the bearings and the background of, okay, how can I do this effectively? Utilize your resources, especially too, and we're in this day and the age where even every day, I'm like, hey, I have a concern about this. I'll reach out to someone. Can I pick your brain about it? People typically are not gonna say no. I don't wanna give you advice. But it's about leveraging your partners, leveraging resources, learning, listening to not just society as a whole, but listening to what your target audience is wanting. If you're trying to tap into a new market, listen to what that market wants, and then you can deliver that effectively. But I know it's scary, but getting over that fear is powerful.
Can I just dovetail for a minute?
Jump in.
Because I'm kind of like, wait, we're literally in a room full of people who started a capital-intensive business and risked their livelihoods and their marriages and their kids' college educations to start up breweries, right? You have already done really scary stuff.
Yep.
So I'm kind of this is reductive, apologies, but I'm is it harder to talk to brown people than it is to put your entire financial livelihood on the line?
Apparently so.
Get over it.
Yeah, so just getting back to, again, I think it does come back to social capital. If it's women you want to reach, or creating these safe spaces like we're talking about is really important. And then also, we're fortunate we have this event space in our beer hall, and we host events. We've done women in the outdoors, fly fishing demonstrations and things like that. And obviously, I'm a woman of color. I've also recognized that representation matters. It shows other people like yourself that there's a place for you here. Because in the beginning, I definitely hung behind the scenes, and I wanted it to be all about the beer. But as time has gone on, for some of those of you I've met or at least conversed with via social media, it's awesome to meet you, and don't be afraid to share your story. And beer is still number one important, but I think it's also important to kind of make that path forward for other folks, people of color, who maybe don't feel like they have a place in this industry.
Yes.
I guess that one of the things that you told us before that was sort of powerful to me was, and it was so obvious, but it just smacked me, was like being invited to do collaboration beers is like such an inclusive thing, but it doesn't
It's not
happen,
so easy
or-
for those of us who didn't come from a family tree, which tends to happen. You know, so-and-so brewed with so-and-so at the other brewery, and they start a new brewery, so let's do a collab. And, you know, so I guess just being a little more thoughtful of if they do want to collab, you know, create an environment that's a little more inclusive or learn from other people, definitely reach out. I mean, those of us who are up and coming and, you know, we're eager to learn and share, those are really valuable learning opportunities.
Yeah, you talk about building a culture internally that's more inclusive, and there's sort of two parts to that. There's a more immediate response that I think the industry is looking for. How do I examine and look inside at my company and decide this company that I've created needs to be more diverse, and it needs to be more diverse in a short period of time. And then there's a longer term, more systemic question of how do we set the industry up so that in future years, 10, 20, 30 years down the road, we've got a pipeline of individuals who are prepared and interested and engaged and actually want to be a part of this industry. So curious to hear from all of you your thoughts on, you know, how you kind of do both of those simultaneously, how you address the immediacy of wanting to be more diverse while simultaneously addressing the sort of systemic problem that there just simply aren't resources or outlets or avenues that are available to reach the demographics long term to get them involved in the space over time.
So oftentimes when we think about diversity, especially as it pertains to this context, we associate it with race or gender or orientation, but diversity is so much more than that. Diversity is everything that we bring to the table. Diversity is our backgrounds, our thoughts, our experiences, our various demographics. But diversity in that sense, what we bring to the table does not matter if we don't have a seat at the table. And that's where inclusion comes in. And what's powerful and what's most important is having a seat at the table and having a voice at the table. Because it doesn't matter what you brought to the table if there isn't a seat for you, if there isn't a space for you, and if no one is going to hear what you have to say. Therefore, people are going to leave, then you're going to have a retention issue. And so all of that would have been for nothing. So in order to build a diverse culture, you need to build an inclusive culture where everyone is welcomed, supported, where voices are heard. And it's also powerful to ensure that you have that representation, that you have perspectives, especially at a leadership level, to be able to point out potential blind spots and to ensure that we are hearing everyone's voices and that we're listening to what our employees are saying and to what our customers are saying. And then in regards to how do you retain that talent and how do you diversify your talent, in that regard, it's about being intentional. Especially in the brewery scene, oftentimes we've hired based on, hey, we have an open position. Do you have a brother or a neighbor or a cousin who might be interested? Well, if all those questions, if we're asking those about an open position, if we're asking people that are in our own social circle, chances are those people in our circles are people that are exactly like us. But if the us isn't diversified, then this isn't going to be diversified. So it's about building those relationships. Let's build those relationships with those diversity-related organizations or those neighborhood communities. Let's get to know them so that when we have a position that comes up, we're going to think about that person instead of my cousin or my neighbor that's exactly like me. Because what's powerful is dynamic teams. And what works is when dynamic teams stay there and work together. They're going to produce more results. They're going to be more effective. Their performance is going to be a lot higher. So it's about being intentional and driving inclusion.
Graci, how have you seen founders evolve in the short time that you've been there? Because I know you joined at a moment of sort of crisis for the organization. So in that very short time, how have you seen it change? What have you brought to the organization?
Cool, great question. Let's jump into that. In regards to how I've seen it change, I can't necessarily speak to how I've seen it change because I wasn't in the organization previous. However, current state, so yes, it definitely did appear to be a state of crisis. And before I joined Founders, I was under the assumptions or under the thought processes that it might have been a state of crisis because that's what I was seeing on social media. But what's important is to learn and ask questions. And so my very first week, to be real with you, I thought, okay, it's my first week, I'm gonna meet with all the people of color, I'm gonna meet with all the females, I'm gonna meet with everyone who identifies as LGBTQ, and I'm gonna learn about the missteps, and I'm gonna learn about what we need to do better. And we have almost 600, or we have more than 600 employees. I've met with nearly every department in the 3 months that I've been there. And in my conversations, I found, I was surprised. I thought I was going to hear about a lot of angst, a lot of injustices, a lot of crisis-related materials, and that's not what I found at all. What I found was we are amidst in this pending lawsuit for racial discrimination, and it was an experience that one person had that wasn't a shared experience among others. And so we're currently fighting the allegations in court currently, and the judge has made a decision just as of last week. We agree with his decision. We feel comfortable and confident that we will prevail in court moving forward. And the crisis is really social media. The crisis isn't internally. The crisis was, what people were saying. People were providing this narrative that was separate from what was going on internally. And so what I learned from from people was, hey, it's a great environment. We love it here. But we had this, this situation that kind of was a one-off scenario that shocked everyone. It was an employee who was who was let go, and then someone who was loved by the organization who then later decided to sue. So it was a very shocking situation for everyone. So I really went in thinking this is a crisis, I'm ready to go, like armor on, like I got it. But it was powerful to realize that the environment internally was not what was being projected externally. So now the narrative, I would say the narrative has changed. We're being very open, very, very, very transparent. During that time, Founders was very quiet, did not have any public responses. We were advised by a PR firm to not make comments. We realized our silence was deafening. And what's important now is being open, having opportunities like this, being transparent, but also ensuring what we realized during that situation is not only did we have the opportunity, but we had the obligation to ensure that as a large global company of more than 600 employees, we need to do everything in our power to ensure that our environment is open, safe, and supported. For that anyone else who comes into the organization will never feel that they were not safe, or that they were not supported, that they will not feel like their voices weren't heard. So I would say the largest thing since being here, sorry, this is a very long-winded answer, but the longest, the most impactful aspect that I've realized is ensuring that our employees are safe, that they have a voice. And as a result, we've done various trainings. So we've done diversity and inclusion trainings. We've done unconscious bias training. Because as we grow, we need to ensure that none of our employees or customers will ever have any sort of injustices, or that they will ever feel that they're not safe and supported.
Yeah. Dr. J, earlier you mentioned that people are going to make mistakes, and there will be sort of teachable moments. In the case of Founders, this seems like the exact type of teachable moment that the industry can learn from. And I'll start with you, but I want to hear everybody's comments. Moving forward from something like this, what should people within the industry take away from the situation that happened at Founders, and what can companies like Founders do moving forward to help their peers and their colleagues within the industry understand how to navigate situations that will arise and do arise?
So I'm not going to comment on Founders because they don't pay me. But I think in a conversation like this, honestly in any other conversation, I think everything is a learning experience for a brewery, right? Literally, everything. And if I had to distill, right, like the kind of swath of things that have been happening over the years, and particularly on social media, my advice would be, think about relationships hard, right? And think about them authentically, as if you want to know people, not just that you want to transact with people. I would say, second, take advantage of all of the resources available to you, particularly when it comes to resources that teach you how to run a professional business, right? Like, we are a community and we have a lot of fun, but we are a collection of businesses. We're an industry, and professionalization is absolutely important. So take advantage of every resource you have, whether it's a manual or an advisor or a mentor, to make sure that you're positioning yourself for success. And then prepare for contingencies. One of the things I offered today was that I think a crisis communication plan is a really smart thing for people to prepare. It's not about assuming that you have to defend yourself. Rather, it's thinking about situations before you get into them, knowing what your messaging is going to look like, knowing what your values are, so you're not defending from an emotional standpoint, and you're articulating your intention, right? Transparency is really important. Knowing why you're doing things and making that clear to those who are stakeholders in your brand value, who are your fans. That's a really great way of kind of putting everything on the table. I don't think that we live in a world where anyone's going to be able to move forward perfectly. And I think we don't allow each other a lot of space for room and reconciliation. But one of the most enlightening things someone said to me recently on Twitter was that they wanted to be more intentional about crafting pathways to redemption in the industry. And I thought that was such a beautiful thing to say, right? Because we do a lot of policing and holding accountable, which I'm not necessarily against. But I do think that we need to make sure that we give people the opportunity to learn, while also recognizing, right, that there are also populations who aren't afforded that opportunity as readily or as easily as others, right? It requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness and self-reflection, and I recognize that can be exhausting, right? Doing that level of introspection, both personally and organizationally, is a toll, and it's an investment, but I think it's a worthwhile investment, and I think it's one that can only lead to positive outcomes.
Yeah. And Shyla, it sounds like you started from a place of introspection initially when you got going with Bow and Arrow. Maybe help our audience understand some of the challenges you faced, getting started as a minority entrepreneur, and how that helped shape the business that you ended up creating.
Yeah, sure. Well, I would say over my lifetime, I've kind of developed a thick skin. And I grew up on the reservation in western North Dakota, went to high school in a border town, so, at a young age was made very aware of some of these tensions that exist amongst sometimes diverse groups. And then I, went on to Stanford, had a lot of folks like, do you think you can really make it there? A lot of naysayers, just kind of a lot. And then even in starting a business and raising capital, it was like, you sure you can do that? And so there was a lot of that going on, but at the same time, I learned a lot of resilience and just believing in myself, but also knowing that, in these situations where, I need to be on, I need to be like really on with, raising capital, for example, convincing people to join my team. So I feel like sometimes those of us, women, people of color, sometimes, we're held to like this higher standard. And so, that's unfortunate. And so I have experienced that, but, again, I think we're resilient folks. We come from a long line of folks who've, encountered even more difficult things. So that sort of has been, my, I guess, motivation to just keep going. But things like, raising capital, that's a challenge for a lot of folks, especially, women, people of color. And I recognize that actually my initial career was in social impact investing. I really wanted to understand that world better and understand some of those challenges. And sometimes it's just reaching out to those communities who are often overlooked. Because, we can talk about them, but if you don't go there, you don't try, they're going to continue to be overlooked. So I learned some things doing that for about 8.5 years, and kind of brought that to my own business and learned some of the fundamentals of finance and things. But I did, there were some doors that were clearly not going to open for me, but I just kept, moving on. The SBA program was wonderful for us. They have dedicated people who do SBA loans like all day long. Well, they work with partners who do. I worked with US Bank, and they, like I said, they've got dedicated people who are within their organizations that do these types of loans all day long. They work with women entrepreneurs and people of color, and they were huge advocates for me. It's kind of a process to navigate. But they were, very supportive of me and my business, even when it felt like there was no end in sight. They were, wonderful in that regard. So as far as sources of capital, we personally invested along with some friends and family, but the SBA program was a great source of debt for us as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we're probably going to get the boot off stage here pretty soon for a musical act of some kind, I imagine. But before we go, I just want to get one final question in here. Everybody's thoughts on where you would like to see this conversation go from here. This is 0.1% of what needs to happen in the industry. It's a starting place on this topic. So where do you guys want to see this topic of conversation go into the future for the rest of this year and years to come?
I think I want to see this conversation go into like small, intense, little groups of people firing ideas back and forth, almost like the kind of thought incubator. I think people do really well when they collaborate and solve problems together. Often when I speak, I intentionally try to push people into small groups to try to like hammer out ideas. And I just would like to see us talk, we have to have high-level conversations, and I want to see them kind of funneling down so that people and communities start having like really meaningful, tactical one-on-ones on the ground.
Graci?
I would like to see topics that come from conversations like this to be at the forefront of all businesses as it pertains to the craft beer industry. I would like to see diversity and inclusion as a whole, and not just as this buzzword of a conversation, but as something that's tangible, that's tactical, that's intentional and authentic, that we're no longer being complacent and that we no longer can be blinded by this. So I would like to see businesses being more intentional on how they're diversifying and how they're leveraging inclusivity in their businesses.
Shyla?
Yeah, I'm excited to see more women and people of color pushing forward and opening, their own operations and bringing, forth their authentic voice and experience and cultures. I'm excited to see more of that, actually. And as it relates to some of the situations we've talked about today, it's not a complicated formula if you really think about it. I think it's a brewery called Temescal. They have a tagline that's like, brew beer, don't be a jerk. Don't be a jerk, and it comes down to like respect and dignity. When you're in these tough situations, I think that's just reminding yourself, like, operate on those tenets, and that'll, get you far. And that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Round of applause for everyone. But I don't know if Sam's still here, but he used to say that the industry was 99% asshole free. And I hope that's still the case. I think it's still the case. And yeah, don't be a jerk, right? Yeah, let's just go off and not be jerks, and let's all be righteous to one another. I'm excited to fail a few more times and have Dr. J just totally eviscerate me on stage. So on that note, a big round of applause for all of our speakers tonight. As I mentioned, we'll have 2 more Brew Talks meetups at Savor and GABF, so if you're out at those events, come join us. And if you like what we did here today, if you want to hear more about health and wellness and diversity and inclusion, we're going to be continuing our conversations on these topics later this year at our Brewbound Live event, our 2-day conference in Santa Monica on December 4th and 5th, so we hope to see you there. Cheers.